My parents were married for 11 years, no child. 11 years. And yet he was a pastor. He said they told him to visit one native doctor to another so they can perform magic. And you know, back in those days, native doctors were very, 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 very influential. My father said he told them he would rather wait on the Lord. My father said with my mother, they waited and waited. 5 years, 7 years, no pregnancy. 8 years, and science had not developed to where there's IVF. So the only thing was to wait. They waited. They waited. Then my mother said that at the 11th year, they went for communion service. Holy communion service. After she ate the bread and drank the wine, while they were praying, she had a vision. And in that vision, they gave her a white leather bag with cotton, something like cotton wool inside. She received it. That in her heart, she knew that was a miracle. That month, she missed her period. And the outcome of that 11 years of waiting is this stubborn man standing before you today.
Every year, thousands of Christian YouTube channels upload sermon clips that vanish into the algorithm within a day. Dr. Abel Damina's don't. For over 3 decades, he has stood at the center of one of Nigeria's most theologically unusual ministries, a man who spent years building a prosperity gospel platform, then walked away from it in front of his own congregation, and rebuilt his entire ministry around a single doctrine: grace. Along the way, he's clashed publicly with some of the biggest names in African Pentecostalism, been formally denounced by a national ecclesiastical body, and built one of the most engaged Christian teaching audiences on YouTube, all without, by most accounts, ever softening his message to keep the peace. But who is the man behind the controversy? Where did he come from? And how did a preacher from a small town in Kaduna State end up reshaping conversations about tithing, prosperity, and grace across an entire continent? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, long before Power City International existed, before the cameras, before the arguments with Nigeria's most famous pulpits. Dr. Abel Damina was born in the 1960s in Kaduna State. He is ethnically a Karama man. He hails from Saminaka, located in Lear local government area in the northern part of Nigeria. Biographies list slightly different years and towns of birth, a common reality for public figures from this era of Nigerian record-keeping, but his northern Kaduna heritage is consistent across every account. His father was a pastor with the Assemblies of God Church, serving a congregation in Zamaru, Zaria. The family home stood immediately beside the church sanctuary, near the north gate of Zamaru, placing young Damina, quite literally, at the intersection of faith and the ethno-religious tensions that repeatedly convulsed northern Nigeria through the late 20th century. Damina has described what happened next many times since. One morning, rioters descended on the church and the family home without warning, dousing both buildings in petrol before setting them alight. The property was reduced to ashes. The family escaped and sheltered first in a nearby military barracks, then in the lecturers' quarters at Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, rebuilding their lives over the following months. It was the first of several brushes with religious violence that would mark his youth. He lived through the May Tatsin uprisings of the 1980s, the Kaduna religious crisis of 2000, and the 2003 Miss World riots, among the deadliest sectarian upheavals in modern Nigerian history. On one occasion during his school years, he recalls, a mob searching for him swept through his school. He fled, spent the night hiding in a female hostel, and left town the following morning. It's the kind of childhood that leaves a mark. A boy raised on the grounds of a church that was burned to the ground, who grew up running from mobs more than once, doesn't easily learn to stay quiet when he disagrees with someone in power. Decades later, that instinct would resurface, not against rioters, but against some of the biggest names in Nigerian Christianity. He completed his secondary education in 1988 at Prince College in Mr. Lee, Jos, Plateau State, before enrolling at the College of Advanced Studies in Zaria for his higher education. By his own account, Damina spent years in ministry, by some of his own statements, roughly 4 decades of preaching, long before the world came to know him as a grace teacher. Much of that ministry, again by his own later admission, was built on the prosperity gospel, a theology common across Nigerian Pentecostalism in the late 20th century that linked financial giving directly to divine blessing. He would later describe himself, in his own words, as having once been considered the barber of prosperity message in his region, a man so immersed in that teaching, in his own telling, that he could collect money even from the devil. That admission matters, because it's the hinge his entire later ministry turns on. This wasn't a preacher who arrived at grace theology from the outside, critiquing a system he'd never been part of. By his own repeated testimony, he had been inside it, successful at it, even before rejecting it. In 1992, according to multiple biographical sources, Damina described receiving what he called a divine vision, a moment he says redirected the course of his ministry. He has recounted the words he believed he heard: "Feed my sheep, for they are hungry. I'm raising a quality people who will stand their ground and not fail me." That vision, he has said, became the foundation for what would soon become Power City International. The following year, in 1993, Power City International held its first service, not in a purpose-built sanctuary, but in a rented cinema hall, the Apex Cinema Hall in Uyo, Akwa Ibom State. From that starting point, the ministry grew steadily over the following decades. Today, Power City International's headquarters sits at 98 Nwaniba Road in Uyo, reportedly seating several thousand worshippers across multiple Sunday services, a considerable expansion from a single rented hall 3 decades earlier. Alongside the local church, Damina built an expanding institutional structure, Abel Damina Ministries International as the umbrella organization, Kingdom Life Network, a satellite Christian television channel reaching audiences across Africa, Europe, the Middle East, North America, and Asia, and the International Charismatic Ministers Association, Abel Damina Ministerial Equipping Network, created to support other ministers globally. He also became known for a long-running broadcast program, Righteous Invasion of Truth, airing across television and radio. By most accounts, he married Dr. Rachel Damina in June 1992, and the couple are reported to have 3 daughters, Jemima, Jesimiel, and Jael, who gained their own public profile as a music group sometimes referred to as Triple J or Triple J+, and reportedly created a YouTube series together. Damina also became a national figure within mainstream Pentecostal circles, serving for 8 years as National Youth President of the Pentecostal Fellowship of Nigeria, the umbrella body representing Pentecostal denominations across the country. On paper, this looked like the standard trajectory of a successful Nigerian megachurch pastor: a growing congregation, a media arm, an international network, a preacher's family in the public eye. But underneath that growth, according to Damina's own later account, something was quietly wrong.
After preaching for several years, I became empty. I became empty and unfulfilled.
Damina has publicly described a moment involving a flight and a book he picked up almost by accident. Unable to sleep, he says he began reading, and within a matter of pages, something shifted. He has described it as a veil falling from his eyes, an encounter he credits with revealing what he calls the missing link in his own life and preaching: Christ, understood through grace rather than through transactional religion. Whatever the precise circumstances, what followed was dramatic. Damina says he returned from that experience and preached grace for 30 consecutive days to his own congregation, a sustained pivot away from the prosperity framework he says he had spent decades building his ministry on. This is the turning point that defines the second half of his public ministry. From this point forward, according to numerous reports, Damina began publicly instructing his own congregation to set aside the prosperity teachings found in his earlier books and messages, describing them as products of what he called his own past ignorance of the true teaching of Christ. It's a rare thing in Nigerian Pentecostal Christianity, a prominent pastor publicly disavowing his own prior teaching in front of the very congregation that had been shaped by it. It would not be the last time he made headlines for what he was willing to say from the pulpit. To understand why Damina's shift mattered, and why it provoked such a strong reaction, it helps to understand what he actually teaches. At the center of his theology is a distinction he draws sharply: the difference between what he calls law and grace. In his framework, much of contemporary Nigerian Pentecostal practice, compulsory tithing, prosperity formulas tied to giving, fear-based teaching about consequences for non-compliance, belongs to an Old Testament, law-based framework that he argues no longer applies under the New Testament covenant of grace. On tithing specifically, Damina has argued publicly that neither Jesus, nor the apostles Peter and Paul, collected or required tithes in the way modern churches often present it, and that some prosperity-linked teachings, in his words, function as a way to scam congregants rather than reflect sound doctrine. It's worth being precise here about what is fact and what is interpretation. That Damina holds and teaches this position is well documented, across his own sermons and extensive secondary reporting. Whether that position is theologically correct is a matter of ongoing doctrinal debate within Christianity, one this documentary does not attempt to resolve on his behalf. What's also documented is how he teaches it, directly, often naming specific practices and sometimes specific preachers, in a style considerably more confrontational than most Nigerian pulpit teaching on doctrine. Damina's reach didn't come from Power City's physical sanctuary alone. It came from a media strategy that predated many of his peers embracing digital platforms as seriously as he did. Kingdom Life Network gave him satellite television distribution across multiple continents years before YouTube became the dominant platform for sermon content. Righteous Invasion of Truth gave him a recurring broadcast identity beyond his home church. And as YouTube itself became the primary way younger Christian audiences consumed sermon content, Damina's long-form teaching style, often unhurried, often built around close scriptural argument, found a natural home there. Conferences became another pillar of that digital reach. Recurring events such as the No Limit International Conference, 30 Days of Glory and Homecoming, documented across multiple years, generated hours of teaching content that circulated well beyond the physical attendees in UEO, reaching a global online audience through live streams and uploads. Combined with a substantial catalog of published books, accounts vary on the exact number, with some sources citing more than 30 titles across topics from grace theology to Christian living, Damina built something relatively rare in Nigerian ministry, a multi-platform teaching brand that didn't depend on any single channel or event to sustain its audience. That reach is precisely what turned his theological disagreements from a local church matter into a national, and increasingly continental, conversation. By the early 2020s, Damina's public criticism of prosperity teaching had escalated into direct confrontations with some of Nigeria's most powerful religious figures. He publicly challenged claims by Pastor Enoch Adeboye, General Overseer of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, one of the largest Christian denominations in the world, including Adeboye's widely circulated remarks about the spiritual significance of tea. He criticized Pastor Paul Enench of Dunamis International Gospel Center and Pastor David Ibiyomi, among others, over prosperity-linked teaching. He also took aim at practices tied to figures like Prophet Jeremiah Fufian, criticizing the sale of branded religious items as, in his characterization, a form of merchandising faith. The pushback was significant. According to reporting from Nigerian outlets, Adeboye responded, without naming Damina directly, by warning his own congregation against mad people on YouTube in three-piece suits. Damina, for his part, responded to that characterization with open sarcasm rather than retreat. Then, in October 2024, the confrontation reached a formal turning point. The Nigerian Supreme Council for Ecclesiastical Affairs published an open letter addressed directly to Damina, accusing him of fallacious and heretic teachings and stating that he could no longer be a representative of Christianity in Nigeria. The letter, signed by the council's elder secretary, characterized his teaching as bordering on what it called hate speech against the Christian faith. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary rebuke, a formal ecclesiastical body publicly disowning a sitting senior pastor with a multi-decade ministry. And then, weeks later, came the moment that would define the controversy for millions watching online. In a video that spread rapidly across Nigerian social media,
I'm going to be apologizing for making a mistake, for saying that if you don't pay tithe, you might not make it to heaven. I'm sorry, that's wrong. That's not in the Bible.
Pastor Enoch Adeboye addressed a teaching he had preached for years, that Christians who failed to pay tithes might not enter heaven. In the video, Adeboye said plainly that he had been wrong, that the teaching wasn't in the Bible, and that what Scripture actually calls for is peace with others and holiness, not a financial condition for salvation. The reaction online was immediate, and it wasn't primarily about Adeboye. Damina's name began trending, with millions of Nigerian Christians online crediting his years of public teaching against compulsory tithing as the force that had finally moved one of the continent's most powerful pastors to change his position. Attaboy himself never named Damina in that apology. But timing, in the court of public opinion, speaks its own language, and to a generation of viewers who had watched Damina take on this exact teaching for years, the message landed as vindication. Still, the moment crystallized something real about Damina's position in Nigerian Christian media. A preacher once formally denounced by a national ecclesiastical council was, in the same news cycle, being publicly credited by large segments of the online Christian public with reshaping how one of the continent's most powerful pastors talks about money and faith. Damina's influence today extends well past Power City International's physical congregation in Uyo. Across Nigerian and broader African Christian media commentary, he's frequently cited, sometimes approvingly, often critically, as a central figure in ongoing debates about prosperity theology, tithing, and the financial practices of Pentecostal megachurches. Commentary pieces, including critical ones from outlets like Church Times Nigeria, describe him as having become what one writer called the nemesis of the church in Nigeria for his willingness to challenge doctrines many consider settled. That influence cuts both ways. Supporters describe him as a rare voice willing to say publicly what many Christians privately suspect about prosperity-driven ministry. Critics, including formal religious bodies, argue that his interpretations cross from legitimate theological correction into doctrinal error, and that his direct, sometimes combative style does more to divide the church than reform it. Both reactions, notably, depend on the same underlying fact. Damina's reach is large enough, and his positions clear enough, that neither side can simply ignore him. Away from the doctrinal battles, the publicly available picture of Damina the person is comparatively modest. Away from the doctrinal battles, Damina is a family man, married to Dr. Abel Damina since June 1992, and father to 3 daughters, Jemima, Jasimiel, and Jael, who have built their own public profile in music and online content as Triple J+. Unlike some of his prosperity preaching peers, Damina has faced public mockery from other church leaders specifically for not displaying the trappings, private jets, large fleets, lavish estates, often associated with megachurch success in Nigeria. His own response has been consistent: a minister's success shouldn't be measured by material possession. That directness, a preacher willing to name names, absorb formal condemnation from religious bodies, and continue teaching largely unchanged in the face of sustained criticism, is as close as any outsider gets to the man behind the ministry. That consistency, whatever one makes of his theology, is itself part of the story. It's too early to write Abel Damina's legacy with any finality. His ministry, at the time of this documentary, remains active and contested in equal measure. What can be said is this: he has become one of the more consequential disruptive voices in contemporary Nigerian Christian media, a preacher whose journey from prosperity gospel practitioner to its most persistent public critic mirrors, and arguably accelerates, a broader reckoning happening across African Pentecostalism around tithing, transparency, and the financial culture of megachurches. His institutional footprint: Power City International, Kingdom Life Network, the International Charismatic Ministers Association, Abel Damina Ministerial Equipping Network, a large catalog of published teaching, and a substantial YouTube and satellite television audience, gives that influence infrastructure that will likely outlast any single controversy. Whether history ultimately remembers him as a reformer who corrected a generation's theological drift, or as a controversial figure whose interpretations went further than scripture supports, isn't a question this documentary can answer. It's a question still being argued, in real time, across pulpits, comment sections, and living rooms. A man born into 2 different Nigerias, Northern heritage, Southern ministry, spent decades building a platform on a theology he now says he no longer believes, then spent the second half of his public life trying to dismantle that same theology from the inside. Along the way, he made enemies among the most powerful men in African Pentecostalism. He was formally denounced by a national church council. And in the same year, he watched, or at least his followers watched, and credited him for it. One of those powerful men publicly apologized for exactly the kind of teaching Damina had spent years arguing against. Who is Dr. Abel Damina? By the public record, a preacher who changed his mind in public, said so from his own pulpit, and never stopped saying it, regardless of who pushed back. Whether that makes him a reformer or a heretic may depend entirely on which side of the tithe envelope you're standing on. If this story raised questions you're still turning over, that's the point. Theology this contested deserves more than a headline. Let us know in the comments where you land on the debate. Hit like if you want more doctrinal teaching from Dr. Abel Damina and subscribe.